be on the YouTube. They would be good.
Yes, we are live, sir.
Okay.
I can't see on the YouTube.
Sir, it's streaming live on YouTube.
Shall I go to the channel?
Yes, sir. We are streaming live, sir.
All right, so in a couple of minutes, we will start.
For our friends that have joined us on YouTube, on behalf of AINET, we extend a really hearty welcome and wish you all a very happy Teachers' Day. It's a really special day today, and we are very excited about today's talk by Professor Mohanty, and we will be starting very soon.
Shall we start? Nadim,
Yes,
how
sir.
many? Are there some viewers there?
Yeah, we'll get the figures as the meeting will go on.
Okay.
We can start, sir.
All right, so let us begin. On behalf of AINET Association of English Teachers, we wish you all very warmly on Teachers' Day. And coincidentally, this also happens to be the AINET Foundation Day. AINET was established 9 years ago on this day in 2011. It began as an informal community, but about 3 years ago, it got converted into a formal association. AINET is a national community of anyone who is interested in the teaching and learning of English, but primarily includes teachers, teacher educators, trainer, consultants, and researchers. And we hold numerous activities around the year for the professional development and networking and exchange among the ELT community of India. We hold an international conference every 2 years, and between the conferences, we have a series of projects, workshops, seminars, grants, scholarships, courses happening. There are lots of advantages of joining AINET, which I won't list here, but I would point out that being a member of AINET, you can also join the International Association, IATFL, at highly subsidized rates. So in short, I encourage all of you to visit our website, www.ainet.net, and find all the details there. And keep checking the website because we come up with lots of opportunities and offers periodically. Today, it's our honor and pleasure to initiate a new series of annual lectures, which we plan to hold every year on the Foundation Day of AINET on 5th September, Teachers' Day. And it's our honor and privilege to have Professor Mohanty inaugurating this initiative and giving the first AINET Foundation lecture. But before we go on to listen to his talk, I just have a few quick announcements to make. I would like to first of all very proudly congratulate one of our active members and also a very active associate on the AINET social media team, Mr. Narayan Mangalaram, who was awarded this morning at the hands of His Excellency, the President of India, with the National Teachers Award. So we are very proud of you, Narayan Mangalam, sir. And we are aware of your immense contribution and innovations. We are taking this opportunity of the Foundation Day to announce a few initiatives that we are going to launch soon. One is the next round of the Teacher Research Initiative. Some of you may be aware that every year AINET supports a group of teachers to carry out research, classroom-based research, exploration into their own practical concerns and try to address those practical challenges, exploring their own context. We call this Teacher Research Initiative, and the fourth cycle of TRI4 is due to start from the 1st of October. Please do watch our website for further details and announcements. We are also on this occasion announcing a grants scheme, which we call Innovation and Experimentation Grants Scheme, where teachers who have got lots of interesting ideas and want to try them out in order to be better teachers and in order to help their learners, please do apply. We will be able to support you with a modest grant. The details of the scheme will also be available on our website soon and will be circulated on all our social media platforms. Please also keep in mind that we regularly offer grants and scholarships to undertake a large variety of CPD activities. So if you wish to undertake a paid training program or a paid course, which you believe is usually important for your own development and for your learners, do contact us and we support them. And we are also going to launch a special course, a short online course for teachers of English, which is due to start from 5th of October, which is roughly 3 months course. And you will end up getting not just a wonderful certificate, but also very useful knowledge and skills. So in short, please do keep visiting our website regularly. Do join us and also subscribe to our social media accounts where you will get very routine updates. So with these words, I hand over to Professor Padmini Barua for the further proceedings.
Thank you, Professor Parwar. And it gives me great pleasure and it's a great honor for me to introduce our speaker today on the first Foundation Day lecture, Professor Ajit Mohanty. Is a former professor and ICSSR National Fellow of Jawaharlal Nehru University. And Professor Mohanty is also the founder, director, and senior advisor to the project National Multilingual Education Resource Consortium at JNU. Professor Mohanty was a Fulbright visiting professor at Columbia University, a Fulbright senior scholar at the University of Wisconsin, Killam Scholar at the University of Alberta, and a visiting professor at the University of Western Ontario, Canada. Professor Mohanty is a prolific writer, and his publications include the very recent publication, The Multilingual Reality, Living with Languages, 2019, UK. And he also has 9 books and over 185 papers to his credit. Professor Mohanty is a fellow of the Association of Psychological Science, USA, and a fellow and past president of the National Academy of Psychology, India. Professor Mohanty has developed mother tongue-based multilingual education policies for Nepal and Odisha in India. He writes weekly columns in Oriya newspapers and has published widely in Oriya as well. Professor Mohanty has been a long-term promoter of multilingual education. He is one of India's most respected researchers and scholars on multilingualism and multilingual mother tongue-based multilingual education. Promotion of education in the mother tongue is Professor Mohanty's lifelong ideology, research, and struggle. We welcome you, Professor Mohanty, and we thank you for being with us today. And we are all very excited to listen to you. So without further ado, I hand over the screen to Professor Mohanty. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Namaskar. My greetings to all of you on this Guru Divas and also the Foundation Day of AINET. I thank you and the organizers of this event for this opportunity and for a very generous welcome and introduction. My focus today is to plead for some rethinking on some of the basic tenets of English language teaching and learning in light of some recent insights in respect of the cognitive and applied psycholinguistic aspects of multilingualism. I believe that such rethinking is a constant, inevitable, and necessary process of teaching and finding meaning in the profession of teaching. Therefore, what I say may not surprise some of you or surprise many of you. But in reiterating my arguments, I seek your indulgence and your consideration of their significance. My roadmap actually involves looking broadly at multilingualism, contrasted with monolingualism, briefly looking at the process of growing up as multilinguals in multilingual societies, looking at some of the features of multilingual mind in view of my own very early studies, as well as more recent, more sophisticated studies done by a lot of researchers all over the world. And I will also look at the role of mother tongue, briefly mentioning my work on multilingualism and development of multilingualism as a past language, So we have in some of my recent, in my book, as well as later on, we have me and Toves Kutnaptangas together, working together. We have tried to float this idea of multilingualism as a past language, not a revolutionary concept, because Grossian and many others had already talked about the bilingual mind as being a composite mind, bilingualism as the past language. Therefore, that we have talked about multilingualism as a past language is not really a revolutionary idea. It's only continuing on the tradition of thinking about bilinguals. I will argue that the primacy of mother tongue and what we have called multilingualism as the first language, these call for some rethinking on how best can English be taught, particularly in a multilingual society like ours. And I will interrogate the immersion assumption, particularly of English language teaching learning process, while I plead for a more significant place for mother tongue and multilingualism in teaching of English, and further placing ELT in a multilingual education framework. I probably wouldn't have time to go very much into details of the MLE framework or multilingual education framework, but I think I would refer to some of the concepts of Jim Cummins, with whom I have worked quite closely. In fact, some of you may not know that Jim and we graduated almost together from the University of Alberta. Jim was a couple of years senior to me, but we had a lot of exchanges way back in 1976 to 78 when I was completing my PhD work in Canada. Jim had already joined as a research associate after completion of PhD work. And therefore, our associations go back quite a long time. And, we still continue with our friendship. Anyway, let us start by distinguishing between multilingualism and monolingualism. If you look at the world around, the world is becoming increasingly multilingual. With a lot of migration, the idea of the globalization and the idea of a global village and all that. Languages are also migrating. But it's my considered opinion that process of having many languages in a particular locality or a particular geographical location does not really make a society multilingual. Gogolin, for example, talks about multilingual habitus. It's the habit of assuming monolingualism as the norm in certain societies. In a paper which we have just finished working, it is in press now. Myself, Mohanty, and Prof. Kankanga's joint authored paper, we talk about how children grow up in a multilingual society, contrasted with children growing up with many languages, as in USA. I have given some case studies. We have detailed, a detailed description of how children grow up as multilinguals in India. I have particularly cited my work and observations from the Kondh children growing up in Fulbani, the district of Orissa. And then I have also given some case studies from USA, children who belong to immigrant families and therefore have many languages around them, but they still grow up as monolinguals because what they demonstrate with multiple languages and even sometimes with personal proficiency in multiple languages is parallel monolingualism rather than multilingualism, or something that linguists will call multiglossia, each language in its own place. In a multilingual society, actually, languages are experienced as a network, not in isolation. That's my understanding, and that's how I have described multilingualism in my own book, primarily based on my own experience of growing up in a highly multilingual society. Therefore, what multilingualism involves is a totality of communicative acts which are put together, fused together in a composite manner in the way in which a child or adult in the multilingual world actually functions. Languages in such functioning complement each other with a lot of fluidity of boundaries. And therefore, in a multilingual milieu, children as well as adults move back and forth between languages without a consciousness of their own proficiency in other languages or or even without bothering to count how many languages they are using, and without having ever bothered about whether they are infringing on some other territory when they cross or go across languages. In USA or in monolingual societies, one would be deeply conscious of not using the the modal language or the normative language, but transgressing into another domain. Therefore, an Indian immigrant in USA would be very cautious and conscious as to when she is using Hindi, for example, or when she is using Telugu or Assamese or any other language, even Spanish. Therefore, I have actually considering all that and the flexibility of boundaries and the way languages are fused into each other. I have actually defined multilingualism in my earlier writing as well as in this book, which I completed in 2019 last year. Defined multilingualism as the ability of communities and persons to meet communicative requirements of themselves and their society in normal daily life functioning in two or more languages in their interaction with speakers of any or all of these languages. I don't think I need to elaborate on this except to say that we need to understand that multilingual functioning involves a totality of communicative repertoire in which many languages may find their own place without even the multilingual user being overtly conscious of using so many languages, some with very little competence and all that. That consciousness is perhaps not there. Now, in my recent work with Tove Skutnap-Kangas, so we have described, as I said, multilingualism as a past language, which involves no counting of languages, as I reiterate that, no evaluation of relative proficiencies in languages, or no sense of infringement into other language domains or language territories, something that I think is necessary part of developing multilingualism as a first language. Now, let me go into how multilingual children actually develop. I'm sort of a lot of studies conducted by me, some of my students and colleagues in different parts of India, Odisha, Haryana, Gorakhpur, UP, Assam, with the Assamese families and Assamese children growing up both in Guwahati and also in Delhi and so on. Now, what we have found, again, no time to discuss these studies in detail, but what we have found is as children move from their home language or whatever is generally referred to as first language or L1 or mother tongue or whatever, they go through what I have described as concentric layers of multilingualism. So once the child starts moving out, particularly I'm thinking of a tribal Kond child who moving out of the Kui home language to the wider sphere of Odia, Hindi, and other languages. I call them the sort of concentric layers of multilingualism. As children move from the home to these layers of multilingualism, they are actually progressively socialized into multilingual norms of socially appropriate functioning with languages. So this is primarily a definition of multilingual socialization. Children's growing appreciation of the norms of multilingual functioning or what is socially appropriate. For example, the understanding that when somebody else, you are in a conversation and somebody else enters who doesn't understand the language of the conversation. Therefore, there is an implicit demand on you to change over to a mutually intelligible language if you happen to know it. Or maybe show some awareness of the fact that the other speaker may have problem in understanding a particular language. So that's part of that politeness norm is part of that multilingual socialization. Or understanding that some languages are better than others or more powerful than others. I will tell you later that by the time children are about 9 years of age, most children in India, regardless of whether they are in urban or rural locations, seem to appreciate the fact or understand the fact that English is placed at a higher level. It's a more prestigious, more powerful language and so on. I think what happens is there are two aspects, two overlapping aspects of growing up in a multilingual society or aspects of multilingual socialization. One is acquiring languages, your mother tongue, and then some competence. It's not necessarily, unlike the monolingual societies, we don't have to ask for how proficient is he. Is he able to talk like a native speaker? That native speaker is a misnomer. Anyway, I will not go into that. That's another area to take up. But there is a process of acquisition of language or languages to different levels of competence, functional competence, not really competence in terms of measured or assessed sense, functional competence primarily. And also acquisition of competence in multilingual functioning, being able to harness whatever proficiency you have in different languages, put them together and use it socially appropriately. That's all. You don't have to show a high level of competence in all the languages, but you can still show an appreciation of the multilingual norms. Now, what we have, again, without going into the details of these studies, our studies were mostly confined to the children between 2 and 9, 2 plus 2, 9 plus. And what we have found on the basis of our multiple studies in different locations in India is that there are broadly 3 periods of development in multilingual socialization. Each period is again further subdivided into 2 stages. So you have sort of 6 levels in which children apparently grow from what I call a state of almost no differentiation between languages to a state of greater differentiation and of languages in the environment, and also a state of appreciation of the implicit norms in socially appropriate use of language. And as I told you, by about 9 years of age, children not only differentiate between languages quite well, but they also have a sort of mental picture of the hierarchy of languages. That a tribal language is less prestigious and therefore lower in the rank compared to Odia, which again is perhaps somewhat lower compared to Hindi and other larger languages, all of which together are perhaps in a lower rung in the hierarchical ladder compared to English. So that kind of understanding sets in. Now, I'm not, as I said, going into the details of the language socialization studies, but 2 points need to be reiterated or underscored. One is that there is a totality of experience of communicative repertoire of many languages. together. When a child is communicating in a multilingual society, uh, it's difficult sometimes to, particularly I'm talking about the tribal children I worked with. It's difficult to say which language is the child actually using at a given point in time. Because child's mind has all these languages, and later on I will tell you that all these languages are also simultaneously activated in the neural processes when a multilingual mind is functioning. But anyway, it's a totality of repertoire which I think one would characterize as multilingualism as a fast language. And then, but it's again very striking and very relevant to what we are discussing, is that there is a heightened communicative sensitivity that comes with growing up in a multilingual society. That's, in a way, multilingual socialization actually involves developing that communicative sensitivity. Sensitivity to different languages, to the contexts of their use, to the different interlocutors, and also to the politeness rules, to the hierarchy, and all that together. So a heightened communicative sensitivity, and also metalinguistic development, awareness of languages. We had some studies with own children, early studies beginning with 1978. So what is this multilingual mind like? What does it involve really? Why is it necessary to talk about the multilingual mind when one is talking about teaching English, for that matter, in our kind of society? Now, I started very young, right after my doctoral work in Canada. Some of you may like to know that my PhD work, unlike Jim's, was not on bilingualism or multilingualism. I was a student of die-hard experimental psycholinguistics, looking at processing of ambiguous sentences under different conditions of bias and all that, and looking at galvanic skin response and heart rate changes as one processes ambiguous sentences. But anyway, that's a different story. When I came back, I started looking at a sort of a site for looking at the multilingual mind. At that time, actually, I must admit, I did use the term bilingual mind rather than multilingual mind, because that subtle distinction between bilingualism of the West and the multilingualism of our society had still not set into my intellectual cognition at that point in time. So it was still studies on bilingual mind. 1978, I started working, and I still continue working with the tribal communities, gradually extending into other tribal communities in Odisha. Then I have done some work with the Bodos in Assam, and then some work with the Madhya Pradesh, now Chhattisgarh kind of areas and all that. Now our own studies, which I call own studies actually, because we had a series of 9 major studies spanning from grade 1 to at that time grade 11 level of students, and school students from the Kon community as well as Odia speaking communities. And also we had at least two studies which focused on unschooled bilinguals, because my argument was that the Western studies are biased primarily because they were working on immigrant populations, which were culturally very different. And they were primarily working in schooling and literacy context, which essentially would mean that whatever the findings they had in respect of the cognitive consequences of being bilingual were actually tinted by the fact that the bilingual, monolingual samples were not only culturally different, but they were also schooled. Because schooling and reading itself, there have been some work to show that might affect the way mind functions. Anyway, so ours, I think the Cone studies were the first ever studies on primarily metalinguistic development, which were outside the English-speaking world and outside the Western world, and located in indigenous population at that time. And therefore, they did get some attention in '94 when I finally published my book. The papers didn't probably get much attention. Not many very highly ranked paper, because those days we didn't have the technology and the mechanisms. Anyway, so that did draw some attention. '94 book published by the Central Institute of Indian Languages, Mysore, as their Silver Jubilee publication, did get some attention about the work on the Cone's bilingual population. Now, what we found there is a very high level of metalinguistic development, even among the Cone children, who otherwise were considered a highly disadvantaged group in the society at that time. Literacy rate in the society, in the Cone society, was very poor. I think it's about 12% among the women and maybe 27% at that time. So what we found is a very high level of metalinguistic ability and high level of metacognition, the ability to think about language. So we did show in those early studies, say about 9 studies published between 1980 and '94, where we did show a distinct metalinguistic, metacognitive advantage of the bilingual children compared to the monolingual. Now, if you look at the current work, then our Cone studies look very primitive, like the population that they studied. Looks primitive because we didn't have the kind of sophisticated fMRI and all these brain mapping technologies and sophisticated experimental techniques and all that. So, the current studies, Bialystok and others actually, they are much more sophisticated. For example, while we were looking at metalinguistic ability, we had a large number of different tests for assessment of metalinguistic ability, but we didn't distinguish the finer elements of metalinguistic ability at that time. And therefore, ours was more gross studies of showing metalinguistic advantage. The current studies actually show a much more fine-grained analysis of metalinguistic ability, looking at specific aspects of metalinguistic ability, such as phonological and sound awareness to lexical, grammatical awareness, and more pragmatic awareness. So different levels of metalinguistic ability. But by and large, the findings of our studies, Cone studies, remain supported in the literature. There are finer discriminations as to whether all children develop phonological sensitivity, particularly when they are exposed to different writing systems, which, as some of you may know, have their own impact on awareness of different aspects of metacognition, such as phonological as well as morphological and syllabic level awareness and so on. So there's more finer analysis, and the current studies also further show that there is an advantage of executive control. The bilingual, multilingual children are able to take decisions, plan their actions, and respond to very discriminative kind of test situations, showing the ability to control their mental processes. And I think this is crucial because we need to realize that a lot of the relationship between mother tongue and other tongue, or mother tongue and development of other languages, relate to a child's ability to control her own mental processes. I will come back to this later. But the current work also show what Jim Cummins suggested as linguistic interdependence. Basically, without going into the technicalities, I will perhaps later on briefly mention his linguistic interdependence hypothesis. But without going into the details of it, it's basically assuming that, okay, the proficiency that you develop in one language, particularly in your first language or in your mother tongue, sort of is interrelated or in the to the proficiency in other languages. And therefore, a proficiency in acquisition of a second language, such as English, is related back to the acquired proficiency or developed proficiency in L1 of a child. So the idea of linguistic interdependence is grossly supported in the literature on or research on how the multilingual mind functions. Now, there is also a lot of evidence to support the claim that a multilingual mind has all the languages activated simultaneously. Some people have found this to be too tall a claim, but the point that one needs to make is that from a neuro-linguistic, neuropsychological perspective, the languages not only remain interconnected all the time, but there is also a readiness of activation. So even if I am speaking to you in English right now, it's not that my English only is activated right here. If somebody in the background is talking in Odia or in another language, my ears actually is sensitive to that kind of linguistic input. So we need to understand that simultaneous activation of different languages, part of the multilingual mind, which I think is distinctly different from how the monolingual individual or monolingual mind functions. So from this, I think we move on to more directly to English language teaching and learning processes. We have to know, or rather the main thesis that I want to discuss is that the instructional processes in English language teaching in particular are dominated by monolingual assumptions, which are grossly inconsistent with our current understanding of how the multilingual mind functions and how children actually learn languages in particular. We need to look at that. We need to understand that in multilingual society, in ELT or English language teaching learning did not assume learning of English the same way as learning of any other language, mother tongue in particular. In fact, in case of children growing up in multilingual context, there is a kind of, as I said, mother tongue development in conjunction with multilingualism as a first language, which in most cases does not involve English. That is why I have, I will not again get into this controversial argument here. I don't have time to settle that issue. But for me, English is learned as a foreign language. Not a second language, not as some people say, Indian English as part of the world Englishes and all that. I have written about it in my book as well as elsewhere. I have reason to argue and to believe that English is best taught as a second or a foreign language rather than as an Indian language. That I think we need to say. Now, the primacy of mother tongue as a medium of child's thinking. People often, including our new education policy and other language policies in education and educational policies, all talk about mother tongue as the medium of instruction. The issue about medium of instruction, will it be English, will it be Hindi, or will it be Odia or the tribal language or whatever. I think the real question is not medium of instruction. The real question is medium of thinking. We are teaching a child. Child is the center of that activity which we call teaching. And if child is the center of that activity, then we should be more concerned about child's medium of thinking rather than teacher's medium of instruction. So my plea is to think of medium of thinking of a child rather than debating about the medium of instruction. Because to me, many of the issues are settled if you focus on a child's medium of thinking, which may be mother tongue, maybe more composite multilingualism as a first language. So if you look at the primacy of mother tongue or primacy of the child's medium of thinking, then it actually calls for interrogation of the immersion assumption in ELT. And also it supports, this is what I would argue, supports the mother tongue based multilingual education model of teaching English. Although I will discuss in my subsequent analysis a level at which we are not going so far as to talk about a mother tongue based multilingual education, but at least accommodating to the multilingualism as a first language to the child's mother tongue and to the presence of multiple languages in the classroom in English language teaching. Some of you, I'm sure, know that Jim Cummins, I think 2007 onwards, started questioning the assumptions in ELT, particularly English taught to children whose first language was not English, English taught as a second language, or English taught as a foreign language. It talks about three overlapping assumptions there. A direct method, that English is best taught in English, that is in the go straight to English. No translation. Translation is a no-no virtually. You don't go back and forth between languages. You teach English, that's all. And then also language as solitude. Language as solitude assumption means that you keep the languages completely isolated. Remember when I was telling you about the differences between a multilingual society and a monolingual society, it is precisely one of the differences is precisely this. That in monolingual societies, languages may be used, many languages. In fact, USA is one of the most linguistically diverse society if you count how many languages are present in that society. However, each language has an isolated place. Therefore, languages they operate as solitudes. There is no place where you find English, Spanish, Hindi, Tamil or Telugu or any other language being used together. You don't find that. These are all isolated, distinct kind of situations. So languages are solitudes. In India or in multilingual society, you cannot assume a language as solitude. No language is completely isolated from the rest of the multilingual environment. So Cummins actually has questioned these three assumptions: direct method, the translation aspect of English language teaching, or no translation assumption, and also language as solitude assumption. Now, the direct method or language as solitude assumption, I put the two together for brevity. It's primarily talks about exclusion of L1 or L1 or mother tongue, whatever, doesn't matter what language you place in place of L1. In teaching of the target language, which is English. Because the assumption here is that if you exclude mother tongue or exclude the first language, children have more time to develop a thinking in the target language, which is English. And therefore, there is minimal interference. So apparently, in a kind of traditional Western methodology of English language teaching, learning as a second or foreign language, other languages are interferences. They are nuisance. So the ideal classroom in such a situation is one with minimal intrusion or interference from the mother tongue or L1 or whatever, and very conscious decision or on the part of the teachers not to use too much of mother tongue. So it's a more direct method which assumes languages as solitudes, and that is taken primarily as axiomatic. And in fact, simple common sense. That is, I think, how Jim Cummins has somewhere described that. It's a simple common sense to say that if you have to teach English, nothing else. Now, studies on how English is taught in our schools, in Indian schools. Our studies on how English is taught in Delhi, a school for the sort of a charity school by a mission, which is meant for children from lower strata or the lower middle class strata where parents do not know English. So we studied how English is taught, and then we had some studies with the Kond and the Saura children, the Kui-speaking Kond children and their schools, government schools in Pulwani district, as well as the Saura-speaking children in Karalakhandi district of Odisha. We had some studies in these kind of studies, and there are also many other studies in India. Professor Padmini Barwa's study on how English is taught in the suburb or maybe in the Guwahati University school or whatever. It shows that L1 is actually used a lot. That's primarily because of two reasons. One is that our total context of teaching is more dominated by certain other languages, not English. And a very low proficiency among the children as well as also among the teachers to a large extent. So we have, in one of our publications, we have actually talked about this as a teacher strategy to to sort of maximize the benefits in teaching. So teachers perhaps take a more conscious decision to engage in more L1 based teaching of English. So the amount of L1 use in English language teaching does not have a clear linear relation. That is something that we have to understand. When you look at the literature on what happens when children, when teachers use a lot of mother tongue or L1 and the classroom allows a lot of use of L1, there is no linear relationship. The assumption is generally that the more time that is spent on teaching, using English, the perhaps better proficiency in English, but there is some relationship, I agree, but not a clear linear relationship with learning of English with how much English and all that, partly because the use of L1 is not systematic and planned. That is one thing I want to point out, that when we critique the use of or too much use of mother tongue in English language teaching learning processes, we should understand that even when a teacher is using mother tongue as a communicative device, in one of our studies, as Padmini also shows in her work, there are a lot of oral repetition and in textbook sentences are read, immediately translated into the other languages, and the teacher goes on elaborating in mother tongue and subsequently comes back to use of some English where children are given drills, asked to repeat English language answers and so on, with the keywords uttered with greater intensity and high-pitched intonation and so on. So we cannot really, since there is no such evaluation, no such planning, what I'm saying is, if you look across the ELT situations in India, you would find a wide range of processes involved in how mother tongue is used or L1 is used in teaching English. It depends on the idiosyncratic processes of each teacher, her own understanding of the processes or of the children and their deficiencies and so on. And therefore, you can't get a clear-cut relationship between amount of use of L1 and developed proficiency in English. But one thing is certain, even if you ignore the fact that, okay, there is no systematic use, pre-planned, systematic, structured use of a mother tongue or first language, even if that doesn't happen, the emphasis is always on communicative exposure to the children, trying to communicate to children. That's more important than teaching English or whatever. So we all talk about in teaching, language teaching methodology, we talk about communicative units or communicative comprehensible inputs. So if you look at that basic idea of feeding the children with comprehensible input, then use of mother tongue is serving that purpose. That's my argument. Now, see, we don't. It's not actually reasonable to expect the use of mother tongue and or first language along with the target language in a very systematic way, but we need to appreciate the fact that it is strategic. It may not be pre-planned, but it's strategic. And work by Jim Cummins in multilingual schools in Toronto, I have visited some of them, where they have schools where all the immigrant children, who just enter the country as immigrants, Pakistani children, Gujarati children, Hindi-speaking children, Urdu-speaking children, Chinese-speaking children from Korean languages, and other a group of different language people. They are put together and are encouraged to learn English while they are also encouraged to use their own language. And that's, I have seen some of these schools, and Jim has written quite a lot about it, how mother tongue, use of mother tongue is harnessed. Of course, use of mother tongue is more systematic in this context, but how it harnesses a high degree of literacy engagement on the part of the child and develops what he calls the identity of competence among children. Their work actually shows that the use of mother tongue or the L1 enables learners of English to construct a sort of a collaborative dialogue. What they do is they put children together. I visited one school in Mississauga, which has a lot of Indian people, Indian immigrants settling in that area. A suburb now, Mississauga is a different town, different city altogether. Anyway, so what they saw is that as children collaborate, their mother tongue comes handy. They communicate, they establish their own identity. So it enables use of L1 there in that context, enables learners of English to construct collaborative dialogue to activate the task of writing English. So they go from the mother tongue to writing English, and the text they produce, they are called by Jim Cummins and his colleagues identity texts, where children are really expressing their own identity, which is reinforced by the use of their mother tongue, or by the not only use, but by a respectful use of mother tongue in that context. So we need to understand, because there are a lot of other people, Robert Phillipson, Fred Genesi, Jim Cummins, and many others, actually show that there is no empirical support for a direct approach or for a language solitude assumption. It's not empirical support. In fact, Robert Phillipson has questioned 5 assumptions, interrelated assumptions in English language teaching. He calls them English is best taught monolingually. That assumption he thinks is wrong. I think right from 1992, when he wrote Linguistic Imperialism, to all his subsequent writings, including Linguistic Imperialism, continued, I think. Yeah, that's the book which published in 2009. He talks about the fallacy in assuming that English is best taught monolingually, and the ideal teacher of English is a native speaker of English, and that the earlier English is taught, the better, and the more English in a classroom, the better. And also the assumption that the standard of English will decline if other languages are used in ELT classes. And research actually shows that systematic use, and that I keep on repeating, I'm not advocating a random use of mother tongue, but I'm advocating more systematic, planned, purposeful, theory-driven application of or use of mother tongue in teaching English. And I think it is not only useful, but it is also necessary. Now, particularly, mother tongue inputs, focusing on metalinguistic thinking and using language as a resource, and those drawing on learners' gross linguistic understanding are extremely useful. particularly, we have done some recent studies because of the problem of in Odisha. I developed the policy for Odisha for mother tongue based multilingual education, and so had some say in how it was implemented. Not all say the bureaucratic processes are quite powerful in Odisha, but we had some say where we identified um, that most of the classroom situations, although multilingual education for tribal children was identifying only classrooms which had children from one language because it's easier to use that mother tongue and then let the children develop multiple languages on the basis of mother tongue. But the model, or not model, but I think majority of the classrooms in India, most places in India, urban centers included, are multilingual classrooms. Multilingual in the sense, presence of multiple languages in the classroom. Children bring their own mother tongue, children bring their own multilingual experience, and all put together, a classroom situation is an extremely linguistically diverse situation. Something that we hardly ever talk about. We assume a very uniform kind of a classroom situation, which is far from true. So what we did is I tried to engage. Unfortunately, I couldn't, one after the other, whatever funding and support I wanted, particularly after my retirement, I lost them. So we did carry on small scale experiments as to how to use systematically not just the mother tongue of the child, but all the mother tongues in the classroom, the diversity, as linguistic resources, and also in a system of teaching which is directed at developing each child's mother tongue as well as developing the multilingual reflection of a child or children together in the classroom. I had developed for Care India, which is an NGO, major NGO, a strategy document as to how to go about it, a detailed planning of how we go about promoting multiple mother tongues proficiency in the class and how we use different languages as social resources. At that point in time, it was agreed that Care India would continue it into experimental schools for the Santal and Ho and other children in Odisha, but somehow they couldn't, because they depend on foreign funding and all that, so it didn't materialize. So that stopped there. But we had, before I developed the strategy document, which is still available with me, we did develop some pilot we did have some pilot studies and all that. I did work with another organization, I forget the name, to sort of, it was a school where it was a school for out of school children who had been out of school for a number of years. They are brought back and put together in the same classroom. Again, children belonging to at least 6 to 9 languages. That is what we observed in the school. And they are put together. They are given instruction for, I think, 2 years. And by that time, they are prepared to go and take admission in grade 6. So set up whatever the early instruction the child has, grade 1, grade 2, grade 3, kind of a children being put together to go to grade 6. And we sort of tried to identify. I used the Jim Cummins identity text kind of material there and a lot of other innovation. But then again, that also couldn't sustain. I had another experiment with a large tribal school in Odisha where we had some funding for experimenting with children coming together, and each child is also a resource person for her own language. So we had 3 to 5 language groups together, and we had some picture material, picture stories, and each child would come and tell the story in her own language um, and then a story would be told in Odia. And gradually, we could see that children were developing a lot of insight. For example, in one of the small, not experiment, but small manipulation or intervention there, what we did, we put a large number of objects, single objects and multiple objects, singular, plural kind of concept. And we asked each language group to write down the singular and plural of that, and also speak it aloud. Now, by the time we went through this exercise a number of times, about maybe 7 to 10 times, when you ask children, suppose you have a Saura speaking child, and you ask the Saura speaking child as to how the we speaker uses plural form. What is the plural marker? If the singular word is this, what would be the plural? And to our surprise, many of our children had that metalinguistic insight in order to generalize the pluralization rules in a language which was not their own. So what I'm saying is that it is possible to think of situations where you draw on multilingual children's insights about language. I have already told you that part of the multilingual children's development is, okay, I think I will stop in 5 minutes. I'm just certainly conscious that my time is getting off. Anyway, so we could show that kind of thing. It's a rich metalinguistic in reflection. And what I suggest is that consciously engage children in a multiple language classroom situations to think of languages, think of how to go from one language to the other, think of monitoring consciously a new language from the known language and so on. So I think what we need to reiterate or come back to is there is no empirical justification for absolute exclusion of mother tongue or L1 from English language teaching. Use of, for example, bilingual dictionaries and translation across languages and all so on are extremely important. And this is
go ahead with his name. Or Kaure ka naam usme rehne Surya Kaure, then Kare and Khandate, and your name. 5.
Was there a question?
Sorry, sir. Yeah, there was a slight disturbance. Sorry, sir. Please continue.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay. I think there's some. Yeah. Now, I think what is we need to understand, I think Chomsky was right when he talks about a child as a linguist in some form. Explicit contrastive linguistics or grammar reflection across languages actually helps children in their metalinguistic development, which in turn helps the children in their not only classroom achievement, but also in their language processes. Now, I think let me skip some of these. Why mother tongue or L1 in ELT? Again, simple thing, that centrality of building on prior knowledge in a classroom to develop new knowledge. Interdependence, which I have already talked about, interdependence of literacy skills and knowledge across languages. Then if you look at the idea of dynamic bilingual, dynamic multilingualism, the European scholars are quoting. Basically, it's a view of multi-competence. The child not developing competence in language X, language Y, language Z, and the competence is sum of all this. It's not that. It's a more developing multi-competence approach, and that we need to realize. And particularly the mother tongue use is significant and necessary because it engages prior knowledge, it integrates the experience and the factual knowledge with conceptual framework. Child's early experience is coded primarily in the mother tongue, and then you are utilizing that to develop further conceptual understanding in a teaching learning situation. It actually helps in taking control over learning processes through metacognitive strategy. You know, that's important. I think I need not repeat what Cummins has repeatedly written about as linguistic interdependence hypothesis, but we need to understand that, you know, from that linguistic interdependence hypothesis, we go to specific languages like English and other languages. So we need to sort of relate, because for me, a language has certain functions for a child. A language or multilingualism as a first language, whatever, the child's medium of thinking or child's language of thinking or languages of thinking have certain basic requirement for him, you know, functional requirement. One is communication. Any language or languages or multilingualism is a mode of communication. So we use language to communicate. But beyond that, there are at least 2 or 3 other levels at which we use language for. One is to regulate our own thinking process. Unfortunately, I will not have time to elaborate on that. And to solve problems, to engage in creative thinking, and finally, and most importantly, to think about other languages, which is basically metalinguistic. So if you put all this together and look at the theory of what Jim Cummins calls the common underlying proficiency, and why is mother tongue necessary to be taught for a few years before the child is taught a new language like English. Because the idea is the child goes from the mother tongue, learns to control the mental processes, learns to use his own thinking, his or her own thinking in solving classroom problems, and consciously thinking about language, meta-linguistic skills. Because the early communicative, social communicative use of language does not require a child to consciously think of language. No mother will tell the child, tell me a sentence using the word tiger or using the word cloud. No mother will ask that. Mother will point to something that is right there, and in the context, it is very much present. It doesn't make a high cognitive demand. And mother says, get me that glass or get me that bottle, water from that bottle. Mother doesn't have to elaborate anything. Whereas in a classroom context, many of the things that children learn are not present here and now. Then they impose cognitive demand on the child, and also they require conscious reflection and use of language. And that is why it is necessary for the mother tongue to be supported for few years. This is the basics of the theory of multilingual education or mother tongue based multilingual education. We need to develop that from what Jim Cummins calls the basic interpersonal communication skill or the basic social use of language to more cognitive academic proficiency in language, which for me is basically meta-linguistic, meta-cognitive use of language. And I think our children have a special advantage compared to the North American situation, a special advantage because by the time they join school, they already have, because of multilinguality in their surrounding, they already have a high level of metalinguistic thinking available to them. And therefore they can reflect a lot better. And so we need to engage children and facilitate children's mother tongue development before we learn English, or we put them to learn English. And this is, as you know, organizations like British Council, whose objective is to promote English all over the world, they are also now, they have come down to this to appreciate this research impact. And they are saying that English in multilingual societies is best taught when it is founded on a strong mother tongue development. So I think because I'm running out of time there, because I'm sorry for that. I will just conclude by what I would call some take-home messages. My first message is rethinking of monolingual instructional strategies in teaching English as a foreign language. And serious research and application of multilingual instructional strategies for promotion of identities of competence among socially disadvantaged children, learners in particular, for a high level of literacy engagement and promotion of their identity investment in classroom learning and learning of English by more collaborative, what I call multilingual activities, activities which look at multilingualism and multiple languages as resources. Linguistic diversity of in a classroom are resources rather than to be viewed as problems. And then I am talking about multilingual educational framework for English language teaching. Children's mother tongue and multilingualism are not problems, but they are resources, cognitive, socio-emotional, and linguistic resources for multilingual instructional strategies. I think I will stop here. I hope I have made some sense, and thank you very much. Thank you. I think I have finished. I don't know if I put you all to sleep.
No. That's thank you so much. That was really interesting. With a lot of food for thought and lot many new constructs. So, Nadeem, how much time we have for Q&A?
We have 7 minutes, sir, to be
7
precise.
minutes. Okay, great. So there are some questions which are already posted in the chat. Mohanty sir, would you like me to read them out, or you want to pick
Yeah,
and
well, I
choose
think
and respond to
you can
questions?
maybe repeat for my benefit while I'm still
Okay,
looking.
sure.
Questions.
Sure. Right. So we have a question from Chenki Kumar. So he is asking, does multilingual surrounding help children to acquire other languages, or it works as a barrier?
Can you please repeat the question for me?
The question is, does multilingual surrounding help children to acquire other languages, or multilingual surrounding becomes a barrier to acquire other languages?
Language is never a barrier. That I think we need to see. Language is not a barrier to communication, particularly for children. We have done some studies with children, in multiple language classrooms, where what they do is the moment they go out of the class, in the classroom, they are all parallel listeners to what the teacher is saying. But the moment they go out, even if they belong to different language communities, they know how to communicate with each other, cross-communicate, and how to play together. They develop a communication network, and this is something that we used in some of our preliminary experiments on using multiple languages in classroom teaching. So children can do that. While you look up other questions, there was one question: does teacher have to know all the languages? No.
Languages, yeah.
Teacher doesn't have to know all the languages. Teacher cannot. So what we have done is the children themselves are resources. That is what I was describing to you, that when we brought in children from 3 to 5 languages, teacher maybe knew one tribal language in addition to English and Odia or Hindi, but teacher didn't know all that. But teacher would use other children as resources, and once you put them together, as I told you, the Jim Cummins schools in Toronto and all that, they are using a collaborative process of teaching learning. There, for example, there is one Mrs. Sastry who is from India, who is the principal of that school. When I visited, she didn't know the languages. The teachers didn't know all the languages, but they were using the students themselves to come up with written texts and do a lot of it. The teacher doesn't have to know. There are ways of getting around that. We in one of our studies in Koraput, we plan to use the the community elders as resources, teachers helper and teachers resources and all that. So there are various different ways of doing that. So the teacher doesn't have to know all the languages of the child.
Okay.
All three language formula, I wish I had time to all that. You know, three language formula is a misnomer. It's, you know, it has outlived its thing. You know, it committed a great blunder when it put a mother tongue oblique home language or local language oblique regional language. That facilitated all the states using imposing the dominant language on all children, tribal children and other children, and therefore it really didn't solve any issue. And then the initial 1967 suggestion in the three language formula was that Hindi belt children would learn non-Hindi language and non-Hindi southern children would learn Hindi and so on. That never happened. So for me, a three language formula is like what they call this. I think you have heard of the river Saluteca in Honduras. It is a bridge in the, you know, a bridge which was constructed across the river. But the same, I think 98 it was constructed, and they had a hurricane, I think about 70 inches of rain in 3 days, and the river changed its course. The road leading to and from the bridge has disappeared. So what you find now is the bridge stands there as a bridge to nowhere. There is no road to it, no bridge underneath it. Our three language formula is like the bridge on the river Salateca, which has lost its context, lost its relevance. It's a road to nowhere, but we keep on repeating for political purposes the three language formula. It doesn't exist. To my mind, it doesn't serve any purpose.
So there is one more question here. So it's from Amol. He's asking, even tribal children develop an awareness of hierarchy of languages and feel their own languages being placed low. So how do we deal with this as teachers?
See, I have talked about the hierarchy and talked about a double divide situation between languages in all multilingual societies, where mostly if you look at the post-colonial society, the colonial languages, English or French or Portuguese or whatever, Spanish, they have become retained the prime supremacy position, and then regional major languages are in the second rung of the ladder, and then the indigenous tribal minoritized languages are in the lowest rung. And India, that is also the case. Unfortunately, our language policy also doesn't go above that hierarchy. One would expect language policy to promote an egalitarian positioning of all languages. That doesn't happen, unfortunately, and therefore we are all, you know, committed to that kind of hierarchy and reinforcing that hierarchy. We need to get out of it. You know, I still don't know how to do it, but we need.
So we have one last question here. This is from Monishita Hasra. So she is asking, keeping in mind the politics of language and multilingualism as pointed out by D.P. Pattanayak, so how optimistic are you about the future of multilingual education in the developing countries?
Well, let me tell you one thing. It's a real confession that when we started multilingual education program in Odisha, already Andhra had started. Unfortunately, Andhra has completely not only abandoned the program, but has made a complete about turn by changing all the tribal language medium schools to English medium schools. You know, that's a different story altogether. But in Odisha, when you went to the communities were not very willing. They would rather have their children learn the dominant language or languages like English and Odia, but not tribal language. That was the situation. Even in my research in the 80s and 90s, I found 100% of the tribal respondents, adult respondents, didn't support education in their mother tongue. But once we engaged with the community, we developed a lot of material to sort of engage in community advocacy and all that. We developed that advocacy among the communities. And once we started the program, and it went on for a couple of years, there are a lot of evaluation, our own students and many other evaluation, which shows that once the community realizes that they now have an access to the school. Earlier they didn't, because school was teaching a language which they didn't know. But now children go back and they freely discuss with their mother and parents as to what happened in the school today and so on. We had a lot of what we call a synergistic reading program where children and adults in the community read together, influenced each other, told each other stories and all that. So that kind of thing were happening. So what has happened once the schools continued for a period of 4 to 5 years, parents and the community insisted that their program should continue. Therefore, even when our research project ended after about 6 years, it was not possible on the part of the government to close down the schools. They had to continue as the mother tongue based multilingual education programs because the community demanded this. Therefore, community requirements are sensitive. We need to make them understand that free choice argument, that parents have a choice of choosing the medium of instruction, that free choice argument presupposes informed free choice. It's not just blind. I can't have a blind person across the street when there is red light just because he has a choice. No, he has to have an informed choice. So therefore, we need to understand that if the community is adequately informed and they know the benefits of their mother tongue based teaching in a multilingual education program, then they do. So one thing we have to do is we disbanded with the idea of multilingual education program as mother tongue schools. We said mother tongue based education which will promote high levels of competence in English and Hindi and other languages, Odia and so on. So that has to be emphasized.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Mohanty, for responding to those questions. So over to Padmini now.
Well, what you can do is share my email ID, you know.
Yeah. Sure. So sure. Over to
Okay.
Padmini. Yeah, yes.
Thank you, Professor Mohanty, for such a comprehensive overview of multilingualism. There was so much of clarity in what you talked about in terms of how we need to get away from looking at multilingualism as parallel monolingualism. And I really appreciate the way you describe the cognitive and social competencies that a multilingual speaker possesses. Sorry, just a second. I forgot to switch on my video. Yeah, sorry, doesn't really matter. I'm also very grateful, sir, for the way you operationalized multilingualism in terms of how, in terms of the dynamic multilingualism that you spoke about, and especially the heightened communicative sensitivity to different languages, contexts of use, politeness rules, even hierarchies, and metalinguistic awareness that multilingual speakers possess. I appreciate the way you distinguish between what we see as multilingualism in contexts such as the USA, where languages have their own domains, and India, where multilingualism is part of our socialization right from birth. I am very grateful that you of the way you interrogated English language teaching practices in India, and you talked about the dangers of the immersion assumptions in ELT, you call them. It was very interesting how you talked about focusing on children's medium of thinking rather than on the teacher's medium of instruction. I think that's a big lesson, a big takeaway for all of us. You have also, sir, given us other home takeaways. You've talked about identity texts. You've talked about the ways in which the first language, the mother tongue of children and teachers, that it may not be a very systematic way of engaging in language education, but it is a very strategic use, and then how teachers themselves employ and activate students' linguistic resources is the way forward. And I completely agree with you that English language teaching has to be placed within these research contexts from which your theorization has emanated. And I think if we are aware of the dangers of subtractive bilingualism, as you and other scholars have called it, in suppressing the languages and the linguistic resources that children bring to their learning of other languages, especially a language very distant from their own experiences, such as English. I think these are great takeaways, and we really need to rethink pedagogy in English language teaching as well as language pedagogy in India. We really need to get away from the restrictions of the three language formula and move forward with the multiliteracies and the ecological awareness of language construction and pedagogy that we are reading more about now. Thank you, sir, for starting this conversation, and I hope that through AINET and I mean in India, all language teachers, we engage with these ideas of multilingual practices as the norm, and not continue with monolingual assumptions that we have borrowed from the Western world. So thank you for a very engaging and a very simply structured. You spoke of such deep theories in such simple language. You had so many examples from your own research studies. We are really grateful for the way you have taken us through the entire, the whole range of issues relating to multilingualism. Thank you so much, sir. And I also want to take the opportunity to thank our viewers on YouTube and other channels, and for the very interesting and thought-provoking questions that some of our participants have brought. We are sorry that we were not able to take all the questions, but I'm sure that Professor Mohanty has very generously offered his email address to be shared, and I'm sure if people are really interested in knowing more, you can go and read his book, all his work. I'm constantly reading sir's work, and there's so much for all of us to learn from there. So thank you, sir. Thank you, my dear participants and friends. And with this, we come to an end of today's talk on multilingualism, mother tongue and English, relocating ELT in multilingual education. Thank you all, and have a great evening and a great Teachers' Day.
Thank you very much. Thank you.